The church was a cathedral of silence. Light fractured through the stained glass windows, spilling red and blue across the polished pews, painting faces in fragments of color that looked almost holy. The lilies at the altar released their perfume into the air, a sweetness that clung too tightly, smothering instead of soothing. It was the smell of endings, of things you could not take back. At the center of it all lay my father's coffin, draped in the flag he had served with unwavering devotion. Stars and stripes stretched across the polished wood, a quiet declaration of the life he had lived. The chaplain's voice murmured from the pulpit, words about service, about sacrifice, but I barely heard him. My mother's voice had already drowned out everything else. "Not here," she had whispered, though the whisper was sharper than any shout. Her hand sliced through the air, barring me from the family pew as though I were a trespasser. "This seat is for family." The word still rang inside my chest, ricocheting like a bullet against bone. My face burned, my palms trembled at my sides. All around me I felt it. The shifting eyes, the rustle of fabric as neighbors leaned into one another, whispering behind black lace veils. Generals in uniform, their ribbons gleaming, exchanged looks. Colleagues of my father pressed their lips tight, as if unsure whether to intervene or to pretend they had seen nothing. And me, his daughter, his soldier, I was left standing in the aisle, adrift in a sea of witnesses. Have you ever felt yourself erased in real time? Not quietly, not in private, but before the gaze of everyone who had ever known your name. That was the weight pressing on my chest as I turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked down the aisle, not toward belonging, but toward exile. The pews stretched out like trenches before me. I passed row after row of faces, some sympathetic, some indifferent, others openly curious. My shoes echoed against the stone floor, each step sounding louder than it should, as if the church itself was keeping count of my humiliation. By the time I reached the back, those rows reserved for acquaintances and strangers, my throat burned. I lowered myself into the pew as though into a cell. From the corner of my eye, I could still see her, my mother in the front, her back straight, her posture regal. Grief clung to her like a well-tailored garment, neat, measured, meant to be seen. She did not turn around. She did not need to. Her refusal was its own performance, a statement etched into the air for all to witness. I sat stiffly, my palms pressed flat against my knees, and tried to breathe. But the organ swelled, the lilies choked, and all I could feel was the sharp sting of shame. Shame not only for this moment, but for a lifetime of them. This morning was not the first time she had erased me. It was only the most public. And as the choir began their hymn, as voices rose toward heaven, my mind slipped downward, backward, into another sanctuary of silence, my own childhood. Because humiliation in a church pew is not born in a day. It is carved slowly, year by year, in dinner tables and living rooms, in Christmas mornings and forgotten birthdays. And as I sat there at the back of the church, the sting of exile still fresh on my skin, I realized I had been living this moment my entire life. If this story already stirs something in you, anger, recognition, or the quiet ache of your own unspoken battles, stay with me. Like this video, subscribe to Military Revenge and walk with us through stories where war doesn't end overseas. Sometimes, the fiercest wars are waged in silence, against the very people who were meant to love us most. The first memory that surfaced was dinner. Richmond, Virginia, 10 years old. The kitchen smelled faintly of rosemary chicken, the table set with polished silverware and china that only came out when neighbors were invited. My brother Liam sat across from me, his baseball uniform still dusty from the game. On the counter beside the sink sat his latest trophy, tall and gleaming under the kitchen light. My mother poured wine into crystal glasses, her smile wide and bright as she recounted every detail of Liam's winning pitch to the guests. "Seventh inning, bases loaded," she said, voice sparkling with pride. "And my boy, cool as ice, struck him out." The table erupted in applause, forks clattering against plates, hands smacking the table in rhythm. I sat small in my chair, my science fair ribbon folded neatly in my lap. First place. Blue and gold. I had carried it home that afternoon, my heart swelling with excitement. But when I tried to hold it up, her eyes barely flicked toward it. "That's nice, dear," she murmured, already turning back to Liam's triumph. The applause swelled again, raucous, joyful, filling the room. My ribbon felt suddenly thin, fragile. I slipped it under my plate, pretending I didn't care. But inside, a silence opened wide, swallowing me whole. It was always like that. At Christmas, Liam's gifts towered in piles wrapped in silver paper and red bows. Bicycles, baseball gear, shiny new gadgets. Mine sat smaller, humbler, books usually. My mother clapped her hands when he tore off his wrapping paper, her laughter rising bright and loud. But when I opened mine, she only nodded once, already distracted. The silence was louder than any noise. Birthdays were the same. The year I turned 12, I performed a piece on the piano at the school recital. I had practiced for weeks, my fingers aching, my heart hopeful. When the final note faded, there was polite applause from the audience, but I searched for her face in the crowd. She wasn't there. A fundraiser had called her away. When I came home, still glowing from my small triumph, she was in the living room in pearls and silk, raising a glass to her friends. "Liam made varsity," she said, her voice rich with pride. The guests clapped and clinked their glasses. My performance, my effort, my joy, it disappeared in the hum of their applause for him. Have you ever sat in a room filled with noise, yet felt yourself vanish into silence? That was my childhood, a symphony for one child, silence for the other. Still, I tried. Again and again I tried. Straight A's in school, certificates for writing competitions, an essay that won statewide recognition. Each time I laid them before her like offerings, my heart pounding, desperate for her approval. Each time she looked once briefly, then set them aside. "Good job, Lexi," she'd say, her voice flat, her eyes already turning back to Liam. The applause belonged to him. The silence belonged to me. And yet my father saw me. He was not loud about it. He didn't parade me before neighbors or brag at dinner parties. But when the house grew quiet, when my mother swept off to galas in dresses that glittered like stars, he and I would sit together on the back porch. The Virginia night sky stretched above us, vast and endless, the air alive with crickets. He would point upward, his voice low and steady. "See that one? Lex, that's Orion. And there, Cassiopeia. Everyone notices the bright ones first, but the dim stars are the ones you follow when you're lost." I didn't always understand his meaning, but in those moments, with his arm warm around my shoulders and the constellations mapped out above us, I believed him. I believed I was more than the silence my mother wrapped me in. Still, the silence left scars. By 16, I had stopped bringing home my report cards. I no longer showed her my certificates. What was the point? The applause had already chosen its recipient. My victories became private, folded away like that ribbon at the dinner table. But even as the silence hardened me, it also sharpened me. Every dismissal, every ignored triumph, every absence became training. Drills for the heart, repetition for resilience. I was already learning how to survive a battlefield long before I ever stepped into a cockpit. And sitting in the back pew of that church, her words still ringing, "Not here, this seat is for family," I realized something I had always known. This exile was not new. It was simply the latest verse in a song I had been hearing all my life. The applause had never been mine. The silence always had. The nights I remember most were the quiet ones, when the house exhaled silence after my mother left for another gala. The clink of her heels would fade down the driveway, and then it was just me and my father on the back porch. The Virginia air smelled of honeysuckle and grass still damp from sprinklers. Above us stretched a sky so wide it seemed to breathe. He would point with a steady hand, his voice low and deliberate. "That's Orion, the hunter. And over there, Cassiopeia. See how she curves like a crown." His words drew constellations like chalk lines against the dark, maps only he could make me believe in. But it was never the bright stars he lingered on. He tapped the faint ones, the lights you could barely see unless you knew where to look. "Everyone notices the bright ones first," he'd say. "But the dim stars, those are the ones that guide you home when you're lost." At 10, I didn't understand. At 36, sitting at his funeral, I realized he had been giving me more than astronomy lessons. He was handing me survival. It wasn't just the stars. He had a way of leaving his faith for me in unexpected places. Once, in the middle of a school week, I opened my lunchbox to find a folded scrap of paper tucked beside the sandwich. In his careful, all-caps handwriting, "Lexi, fly straight. You're stronger than you think." I kept that note in my pocket all year, smoothing its wrinkles when the world felt too sharp. Another time, when I was 13, I played a clumsy violin piece at a school concert. My mother dismissed it outright. "I have a committee meeting, darling. You'll understand when you're older." But that night, as I scanned the crowd from the stage, I spotted him in the back. No suit, no military ribbons, just my father, his face calm and intent, as though my screeching bow was worth every minute of his time. He didn't clap louder than anyone else, but his hands met steadily, deliberately, as if to say, "I see you." And he was always there like that, my silent audience, the witness to the things no one else cared to see. When I stumbled through a spelling bee, when I brought home drawings smudged with pencil dust, when I stayed up late writing essays by the thin glow of a desk lamp. He didn't always speak, but he showed up. And showing up when no one else did was sometimes the only lifeline I had. Once, he took me to the Air and Space Museum in D.C. I still remember the reverence in his eyes as we stepped into the hangar, planes towering above us like monuments. "Every one of these tells a story," he whispered. My fingers traced the cold metal of an F-4 Phantom, paint chipped but proud. Then he guided me toward a simulator cockpit. "Climb in, Lex." My heart pounded as I slid into the seat. The canopy arched above me, the controls spread out like a secret language waiting to be learned. My feet barely touched the pedals, but for a moment I felt what he felt, the possibility of flight. When I looked at him, he was smiling, not the small polite curve of lips he wore at dinner parties, but a full, unguarded smile. Pride. The kind of pride I never once saw mirrored in my mother's face. That moment stayed with me, lodged in my chest like a compass needle. To the outside world, he was Colonel Hayes. To me, he was the quiet believer, the one man who saw value in the daughter no one else seemed to notice. And even now, sitting in the church years later, his coffin draped in the flag, I clung to those nights, those scraps of paper, that faint smile across the museum hangar. Because when the applause never came, when silence became my inheritance, he was still there, my single steady star. At 15, I first touched the sky. It was part of a junior aviation program, the kind of opportunity most kids in my town didn't even know existed. My father had nudged the application toward me with that same quiet encouragement. "Try, Lex. Just try." The first time I gripped the yoke of a training plane, my palms were slick with sweat. The engine roared to life, rattling through my ribs, vibrating against every bone in my body. The sound was overwhelming, louder than church bells, more consuming than any hymn, terrifying and sacred all at once. As the wheels lifted, the ground fell away and my breath caught. The houses shrank, the fields stretched, the horizon widened until it swallowed everything. For the first time in my life, silence was not absence, it was freedom. But even then, I carried his voice in my ears. "Stay steady, Lex. Dim stars, remember. Guide yourself by the ones no one else sees." Flying wasn't just a skill. It was survival turned into motion. Every checklist, every maneuver, every heartbeat was proof that I could carry myself where no one else thought I belonged. When the day of my first solo flight came, my nerves felt raw, stripped down to bone. My mother predictably had other plans. A luncheon, a committee, something glittering enough to excuse her absence. But my father stood at the end of the runway, arms crossed, shoulders squared, a silent sentinel. I climbed into the cockpit, my hands trembling, my pulse racing like the organ in a funeral hymn. The engine screamed as I throttled forward, and for a second I almost panicked, almost froze. But then in my mind I heard him again. "Steady, Lex. You were made for this." The wheels left the ground. I was alone, truly terrifyingly alone, and yet it felt right. When I landed, the plane rattling back down to earth, I scanned the runway. He was there, waiting. He didn't cheer. He didn't shout. He simply clapped once, slow and steady, his eyes locked on mine. That single clap meant more than 1,000 ovations. It was recognition distilled into a gesture. It was proof that someone believed, and I carried that sound with me into every cockpit afterward, like a talisman. Now, sitting at the back of the church, his coffin before me, the memories pressed in like waves. The porch under the stars, the museum hangar, the folded note in my lunchbox, his steady clap at the end of the runway. He was gone. The one audience who had ever seen me, the one voice that had ever cut through my mother's silence, lay still beneath the flag. And with his absence, the world felt more hollow than I had ever feared. Yet even as my throat burned with grief, I could still hear him. "Dim stars, Lexi. They'll guide you when you're lost." My mother sat at the front, radiant in her grief, her exile of me complete. The community saw me as cast out, erased, dismissed. But deep inside, under the weight of her rejection, I felt something steadier. His words, his faith, his hand pointing to constellations I could still trace if I dared to look. I shifted on the hard wooden pew, my palms trembling against my knees. My body was shaking. Yes, but inside, some part of me still stood tall. Because grief had stolen his voice, but not his legacy. And as long as I remembered those dim stars, I would not vanish. I sat at the back, a daughter exiled, a soldier silenced, but not destroyed. The smell of lilies clung to the church, thick and unrelenting. I tried to breathe past it, but the sweetness was suffocating. And in that heavy perfume, my mind betrayed me. Suddenly, I was no longer in Virginia. I was 24 again, my lungs filled with the acrid taste of sand and gun oil in the desert of Iraq. It is strange how grief carries you where you least expect, how the fragrance of flowers at a funeral can summon the stench of war. The first time I flew into combat was 2008. I was 24, barely out of training, still young enough to believe courage meant having no fear. The cockpit of my F-16 shimmered with heat, every instrument rattling, every switch alive. Below me stretched the parched dust of Anbar Province, endless and unforgiving. There was no room for hesitation. Every move carried the weight of lives on the ground. The radio crackled that day. Convoy ambushed outside Fallujah, coordinates tumbling from frantic voices. I banked hard, the G-forces pressing me into the seat, eyes locked on the desert floor. Fire blossomed in the distance, a terrible flower opening in the sand. I dropped once, then again. Silence followed, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence of men still alive because I had done my job. For a moment, suspended between earth and sky, I felt a kind of purpose that nothing else could touch. But purpose fades quickly when no one is there to receive it. When I landed, my body drenched in sweat, my pulse still running ahead of me, the tarmac stretched empty. No banner, no waiting faces, no mother holding me tight. Just silence, always silence. The church bells tolled then, pulling me back to the pew, their heavy notes shaking the stained glass windows. For a second I was disoriented. Was it the bells of Virginia, or the metallic clang of warning alarms over Kandahar? I blinked, and the two collapsed into one. That is how memory works. War seeps into everything. By Christmas 2010, I was calling home from a tent lit by a single lantern, dust so thick it coated my throat. I had just buried a young airman under my command, a boy barely 20 whose helmet still bore a photograph of his high school sweetheart. My face was hollowed by exhaustion, my eyes rimmed with sleepless nights. When the video call flickered alive, I saw them, my family in Virginia, my mother's living room glowing with garlands, champagne, and laughter. My brother held up keys to a brand new BMW, her gift to him. Her smile froze when she saw me. "Oh goodness, Lexi," she sighed, irritation threading beneath her concern. "You look dreadful. Are you eating properly? Not are you safe, not are you alive." And just like that, the conversation moved on. Holiday parties, social calendars, the world that never had room for me. On that glowing screen, I was not a daughter calling from war. I was a shadow, a ghost no one wished to see too clearly. That was the night I learned the cruelest silence isn't the kind you endure in the desert. It's the kind you come home to. The minister's voice rose at the altar, words about sacrifice and eternal rest, but my mind carried me further still. 2012. Helmand Province. I flew low over villages where every rooftop might hide a rifle. I lost friends in fireballs that turned night into day. I wrote letters to mothers whose sons would never return, my hand shaking, my words always falling short. Yet in Virginia, my own mother told her friends I worked in administration. She never said fighter pilot. She never said combat. Easier to erase me than to explain me. To her, my service was clutter. My medals, packed away in boxes, were little more than dust. The truth is, medals shine brightest in silence. They gleam under display lights but rarely catch the eye of the people who most need to see them. In 2013, I stood at attention under a scorching Iraqi sun to receive the Silver Star. My uniform pressed, my hands steady, though my heart trembled with the weight of comrades lost. I searched the crowd foolishly for her face. She wasn't there. A charity gala had called her away. Somewhere in Richmond, she was smiling in pearls, captured in photographs brighter than the sun over me. The choir swelled in the church, voices lifting upward, and it struck me with a bitter irony. Strangers will sing for your soul in death, yet some mothers will not clap for you in life. I told myself her absence didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need her applause. But deep down, there is a wound that never closes when the person who gave you life cannot see the life you've built. And it wasn't only her. Society, too, preferred to look past us. On leave, strangers asked polite questions, then shifted the subject quickly, as if war was contagious. They wanted the glittering hero, not the hollowed veteran who smelled of sand and jet fuel. So I buried it all. The ghosts of Fallujah, the fireballs over Helmand, the faces of friends I could not save. I buried them as deep as the bodies we laid in foreign soil. But through it all, one voice remained. My father's. His letters during my deployments were anchors, steady words, careful handwriting. He reminded me of stars, of constellations, of the dim lights that guide when the bright ones disappear. He called me his dim star, not dazzling but constant. And now he was gone. With his death, there was no one left in my family who remembered who I truly was. My mother had erased me. My brother had replaced me. Society had forgotten me. All that remained was the soldier. The lilies' scent thickened in the sanctuary, dragging me back to the present. I sat in the back pew, my body rigid, my hands clenched in my lap. And I knew when she barred me from the family row, it wasn't just rejection. It was the echo of every dismissal, every silence, every erasure I had carried since childhood. It was proof that in her eyes, I had never belonged. But I also knew this: the dim stars do not vanish when the bright ones steal the stage. They remain, guiding quietly, constant in the dark. And if you are still here, listening, then you know what I mean. You have your own wars, your own silence. Maybe, like me, you fought battles no one else even saw. This was where my new war began, not in the skies of Iraq, not with rockets or tracer fire, but here, at home, in a pew too far from the altar, with silence sharp enough to wound. And once you've survived the desert, you learn a truth that no one can take from you. You can survive anything, even your own family. The funeral was supposed to be an ending. That's what everyone tells you, isn't it? A funeral closes a chapter, lays the dead to rest, and leaves the living to heal. But for me, it was no ending. It was an opening salvo. My father's burial didn't mark the silence of grief. It marked the beginning of war. Outside the church, the winter air bit at my skin, sharp and metallic. My mother clutched the folded flag like a general clutching her victory. For one aching second, I imagined it was unity, that she held it for both of us. But the look on her face said otherwise. It was possession, dominion. A crown, not a memory. She did not look at me. She didn't need to. Her order in the sanctuary still rang, not here. This seat is for family. And in that silence, I knew she wasn't finished. A week later, the first strike landed. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, Liam's name flashing. My brother, who had stood beside her in the pew while I sat exiled in the back. His voice was cautious, guilty. "Lexi, have you seen the Virginia Society Journal?" I hadn't. Why would I? That glossy magazine belonged to her world of charity galas and garden luncheons, but I clicked the link. The headline detonated inside me like shrapnel. The Hayes family tragedy, a daughter lost to war. My name filled the paragraphs, but not my truth. Words like unstable, volatile, difficult to manage. They claimed I had walked away from the Air Force under troubling circumstances. They hinted at jealousy toward Liam's success, bitterness over being overshadowed. And then the photograph. It was me after 72 sleepless hours in Iraq. Dust smeared across my face, eyes ringed with exhaustion, my lips pressed tight against the grief of losing a soldier I couldn't save. To me, that photograph was a scar of service. To her, it was ammunition. Cropped, distorted, magnified, it looked like madness. In that moment, the lilies of the funeral seemed to choke me again, their sweetness turned rancid. I was back in 2009, Anbar province, debriefing after a night mission that had gone sideways. A lieutenant colonel glanced at me across the table, his words cutting. "Captain Hayes, you look unstable. Are you sure you're fit to fly?" Unstable. The same word. The desert had tested me, but it was her voice, echoed in that headline, that truly broke through my armor. Tell me, have you ever seen your own pain twisted into a caricature? Your lowest moment paraded as proof you are broken. That was when I realized my mother's silence had never been apathy. It had been reconnaissance. She had been waiting, biding her time, collecting weapons. And now she had unleashed them. But she wasn't done. 3 days later, I came home to find a manila envelope slipped under my apartment door. No return address, no note. Inside, legal documents, crisp and bloodless. Consolidation of family assets. At first, it read like routine paperwork, clauses, sub-clauses, legal dust. But hidden deep within was the ambush, the relinquishment of inheritance rights. My father's house, the white-columned colonial that had been both cradle and prison, was to pass to her, then to Liam. My name nowhere. My claim erased. I spread the papers across my kitchen table. The folded flag from the funeral sat beside them. Paper versus cloth. Her weapon versus his memory. As my eyes blurred over the sterile text, I heard the tolling of church bells again. The same bells that had rung at the funeral. And just like that, I was no longer at my table. I was back in Iraq, 2011. Kandahar. Rockets screaming into the base, alarms splitting the night. We dove for cover, the earth trembling. When the dust cleared, someone shoved a clipboard at me, forms to sign, testimony to write, boxes to tick, even as smoke still curled in the sky. Paper had always been its own kind of weapon, bureaucracy that could erase the faces we had just lost. And now my mother wielded it with the same precision as any military strike. Do you know what it feels like to survive rockets, only to be ambushed by a pen? To stand under enemy fire, only to find the most devastating assault waiting at your doorstep in Virginia? It wasn't property she was stealing. It was legacy. My father's legacy. The last tether to the man who had believed in me when no one else did. And she wanted to sever it, to erase not just my inheritance, but my very place in the story of our family. Then came the whispers. Neighbors I had known since childhood averted their eyes at the grocery store. Invitations evaporated. Friends stopped calling. The narrative had spread too well. She's not well. She's unstable. Such a shame what war does to some people. That Sunday at church, I felt the weight of their stares. Heads turned as if measuring me against the rumors. I remembered the pews stretching like trenches at my father's funeral, faces turning the same way. And I was transported back to Iraq, 2012, when I had returned from leave and heard men at the officers' mess muttering, "That's Hayes, the one who flies like she's got nothing left to lose." Their voices weren't meant for me, but I heard them. I always heard them. Have you ever felt the world close its doors on you, not because of who you are, but because of what someone else decided you were? The silence of the desert had been brutal, but at least it was honest. This silence, the silence of being erased in your own hometown, was unbearable. And yet, somewhere in those ashes, something stirred. A fire, a memory. My father's voice under the Virginia stars, tracing constellations with his finger, be the dim star Lexi. Quiet, constant. Not the glitter that blinds, but the light that guides. For the first time since the funeral, clarity cut through. She wanted me erased. She wanted me broken. She wanted me gone, but I was still here, and I was not going anywhere. That night, I laid the documents flat across the table, the flag beside them. Her lies on one side, his legacy on the other. And I made a vow she would not erase me, not from the house, not from his memory, not from myself. I picked up the phone, not to call Liam, he had chosen his side. Not to call her, her silence was louder than any words. I called a comrade. A man I had once dragged from wreckage in Iraq, 2008. When he answered, his voice was steady, unwavering. "Lexi." I told him everything, the article, the papers, the betrayal. When I finished, there was silence, but not the silence of erasure, the silence of a soldier listening. Finally, he said, "Then it's time you fight back, not as a daughter, as a soldier." Do you hear that? That's the ground shifting. That's the moment grief hardens into resolve, when silence becomes strategy. Maybe you've had that moment too, at a desk, in a car, in a room where the weight finally breaks you. When you whisper to yourself enough, "That was my moment." From then on, I stopped thinking of it as family. I started thinking of it as battlefield, and in battle, you don't wait for mercy. You fight for survival. She had chosen her weapons, lies, manipulation, erasure. I would choose mine, truth, memory, and the discipline of a soldier who has already survived hell. This wasn't about property anymore, or whispers, or even the article. It was about reclaiming my place in the story, my story. Because if I didn't fight, I would vanish, and I had survived too much to disappear now. I pressed my hand to the flag, whispered the words my father once gave me under the stars. "Stay your course, Lexi. Be constant. Be the light that guides." And I knew the real war was only just beginning. The night I spread those legal papers across my table, I thought the loneliness would consume me. Outside, the city hummed, traffic lights blinking, horns echoing faintly, life going on as if my world hadn't been set ablaze. Inside, it was only me, the folded flag, and a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest like armor I couldn't take off. That's when I realized I could not fight this war alone. The first call was instinctive, a voice I hadn't heard in years, but one I knew would answer. Captain Sarah Donnelly. We had flown together over Iraq, wing to wing, the kind of bond only forged when fire licked the edges of your cockpit and you weren't sure if you'd make it home. She had been there the night my jet took a hit, the night I pulled her wrecked plane's coordinates into my comms and refused to leave her behind. When her voice came through the line, it was steady, warm in a way I hadn't expected. "Lexi," she said, and in that single word I felt the weight lift just enough to breathe. I told her everything. The article, the papers, the humiliation at the funeral. She didn't interrupt. She didn't doubt. She just listened as soldiers do. And when I finished, she said, "You kept me alive in the desert. I'm not about to let them kill you here." Isn't it strange how sometimes family is not the people you're born to, but the people who stood beside you when the sky was burning? Have you ever felt more at home with a friend than with your own blood? Sarah came the next day. I still remember the knock on my door, sharp and certain, like she was announcing the arrival of reinforcements. She stepped inside with the confidence of someone who had crossed too many battlefields to be fazed by the petty war of suburbia. She carried no flowers, no sympathy. Instead, she carried a leather satchel filled with notes, contacts, and an old pilot's logbook. "Every fight has a playbook," she said, placing it on my table. "Even this one." That evening, another ally arrived, unexpected yet inevitable. Ava Martinez, the journalist who had once embedded with our unit for a profile years back. She was supposed to write about female pilots in combat. What she ended up writing was something truer, the invisible weight of command, the quiet strength of women who fought twice, once in the field, once at home. When she heard what had been printed about me, she didn't hesitate. She came with her recorder, her notes, and a look of defiance. "They want to erase you, Lexi," she said. "But I've seen you. I'll help you make sure the world sees you too." And just like that, the isolation cracked. But there was one more name Sarah insisted on calling. "Rachel Kim," she said, pulling out her phone. "Air Force JAG. She's the one who kept me from getting court-martialed after my wing clipped that fuel truck in Balad. And if I remember right, she helped you once too." Her words pulled me back years, to Iraq, 2007. I remembered stumbling into the JAG office after a mission that had gone sideways. Dust caked on my uniform, eyes burning from 3 days without sleep. One of my men had gone down, and command demanded a report by sunrise. My hands shook as I tried to put into words what no words could hold: the fireball, the silence, the helmet cracked open on the sand. Rachel was there. A young captain then, black hair tied in a knot, glasses perched on her nose as she looked up from a stack of files. She didn't just help me draft the report. She steadied me. She guided my words with the kind of precision that felt less like bureaucracy and more like mercy. And at the end, she slid a glass of water across the desk and said quietly, "Law can be armor too. Don't forget that." Now, nearly a decade later, Sarah was dialing her number. When Rachel arrived, she brought no flowers, no recorder, no logbook. She brought a briefcase. And with it, the weight of something my mother had underestimated: law. She spread the inheritance documents across my table, flipping through with a precision that reminded me of a surgeon. Her brow furrowed, her finger tapping clauses, subclauses, buried traps. "She's good," Rachel said finally, meaning my mother. "But not good enough. She's left holes. Holes we can widen until the whole facade crumbles." For the first time, I felt the battlefield tilt. My mother had her weapons, whispers, articles, forged perceptions. But now I had mine. The apartment transformed into a war room. Sarah drew diagrams like sortie maps. Ava traced networks of influence like enemy troop movements. And Rachel spread legal texts and precedent cases like ammunition across the table. I sat at the center, listening, remembering how to command. Each of them brought their own kind of fire. Sarah, blunt, unyielding loyalty forged in combat. Ava, sharp-eyed truth, unafraid to shine light in the darkest corners. Rachel, methodical, relentless, a lawyer who treated silence like an adversary to be cross-examined. And me, I was the axis they turned around, the soldier who had been cornered, now stepping back into the role of leader. Have you ever felt the shift when despair becomes strategy? When grief transforms into planning and planning tastes like hope? One night, after hours of cross-checking files, Sarah leaned back in her chair and said, "You realize what this is, don't you? She's running a disinformation campaign. Same as we saw overseas, psychological warfare." Rachel adjusted her glasses, eyes flashing. "Then we treat it like counterintelligence. Collect, document, expose." And Ava, tapping her recorder, added, "and publish. Reputation is her kingdom. Truth is the torch that burns it down." That was the moment the plan crystallized. By the third week after the memorial, our mission was clear. Sarah gathered testimonies from comrades who had flown with me, men and women whose lives had depended on my decisions in the sky. Ava lined up sympathetic journalists, prepared to run the story of erasure, complete with records, logs, and my father's own letters. Rachel prepared filings, drafted counterclaims, and outlined a trust that would turn my father's house into something greater, a living legacy. Each night, as coffee cups stacked higher and papers spread wider, I felt something I hadn't in years: belonging. And I thought, this is family. Not the kind that casts you out of the front pew, but the kind that stands beside you when the sanctuary falls silent. Rachel said it best one night, her voice quiet but unshaken. "Your mother has played this as a private war. We'll make it public. She'll never erase you again." I looked at the three women around me, pilot, journalist, lawyer, and I realized I wasn't fighting for survival anymore. I was fighting for reclamation. And I wasn't fighting alone. 3 weeks after the funeral, on a gray January morning, the city gathered again. This time it was not for burial, but remembrance. The memorial service for Colonel Daniel Hayes was public, open to veterans, journalists, politicians, neighbors. A spectacle of grief and honor, carefully staged. And I knew my mother would be at its center, orchestrating it like a general parading her victory. The night before, I could not sleep. The hum of traffic beyond my apartment window was not traffic anymore. It was the sound of convoys rolling through Baghdad. Each honk, each tire screech, my mind turned it into echoes of war. I lay awake, my medals glinting faintly on the chair, and whispered to myself the question that kept gnawing: am I ready to stand? Not in the shadows, not in silence, but in daylight where no one can turn away. When dawn broke, I dressed slowly, deliberately. Each piece of the uniform was armor. Each medal a scar displayed openly. My silver star gleamed under the lamplight. I ran my thumb across it, and instantly I was back in Fallujah, dust storm choking the air, my jet trembling under flak, the desperate radio crackle of men on the ground calling my name. I had survived that night. I had not flinched. So why flinch now? The church loomed ahead, its steeple a silhouette against the pale winter sky. Inside, the sanctuary was swollen with bodies, the air thick with lilies and candle wax. As I stepped through the doors, the world shifted. My heels echoed across marble, click, 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 and the sound dragged me back to the tarmac in Iraq, my boots striking against metal ladders as I climbed into the cockpit, heart hammering before takeoff. Heads turned. Whispers rose like a wind. Their stares pierced my chest, but I held steady. I had felt stares like these before, in debrief rooms where every misstep could mean lives lost. My training steadied me. My silence became discipline. I saw the veterans first, my father's old comrades straightening in their pews, eyes drawn not to my face, but to the wings on my chest. Recognition flared there. Then neighbors, relatives, politicians. Their whispers coiled through the sanctuary, suspicion sharpening into awe, awe into disquiet. And then her. My mother sat at the front, spine regal, face polished, grief draped over her like pearls. But when our eyes locked, the mask cracked. Just for a flicker, I knew that look. I had seen it in enemy commanders caught off guard when their line broke. Shock, fury, the sudden awareness that control was slipping. The minister spoke. Hymns rose like smoke curling against stained glass windows. My mother ascended the lectern, paper in hand, her voice calm, elegant, practiced. She spoke of legacy, of Liam, of honor. And with surgical omission, she erased me. My name did not exist. But erasure does not last forever. Not when truth burns beneath it. Ava stood. Her heels struck wood, her back straight. My memory split in two, the church and Iraq, 2006. I saw Ava in her dusty flak jacket, notebook in hand, the journalist who once told my story when others tried to silence it. Now here she was again, her voice clear as gunfire. Colonel Hayes's legacy does not belong to silence. It belongs to Captain Alexandra Hayes, his daughter, a decorated combat pilot, a soldier who carried his spirit into the skies. The sanctuary froze. Dozens of eyes swung toward me. My medals glinted under the light, sharp as stars. Then Sarah rose, a folder in hand. My mind fractured again, church pew, Iraq bunker. I saw her in desert fatigues, grease streaking her cheeks, her life in my hands the night I circled her wreckage. And now her voice cut like steel. These are the records, commendations, testimonies, proof. The room shifted. Murmurs rippled through pews. Veterans nodded, lips tight. Politicians leaned forward. The tide was turning. And then my father's voice. Ava pressed play and his words poured through the sanctuary. He spoke of me, his daughter, his pride, his legacy. His voice carried like the hum of an engine in the night, steady, guiding, undeniable. The air stilled. My mother's face broke, white with fury. She lurched up, voice sharp, brittle. Lies, she's unstable, you all know, but her words shattered against his. Every accusation turned hollow when set against truth spoken from the grave. Eyes turned from her. Her fortress collapsed silently, like sand swept by desert wind. And then it was my turn. I rose, slowly. My knees trembled, but I steadied them the way I had steadied the stick in turbulence over Baghdad. My uniform caught the light. My medals gleamed. And when I spoke, I was no longer 10 years old begging for recognition, no longer 24 bracing in a cockpit. I was 36, a soldier, a daughter. I fought for this country. I flew through fire. I carried men through hell, and I came home with ghosts I will never outrun. For years, my own mother tried to erase me. But today, here, I claim my name. Not for revenge, for recognition, for my father. For a legacy built not on silence, but on sacrifice, on honor, on truth. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the applause began. Hesitant at first, then swelling. A murmur of clapping transformed into thunder rolling through the sanctuary. People stood, one by one, their hands striking together in rhythm. My chest tightened because the sound was not just applause. It was the echo of another time, another place. After a night sortie over Ramadi, when I landed shaking, heart raw with terror and triumph. My wingmen had crowded me, their gloves smacking my shoulders, their hands clapping my back. You kept us alive, Lexi. You brought us home. That sound, their hands, their laughter, now blended with this applause, these strangers, this congregation. Two worlds, one recognition. I closed my eyes briefly. For the first time in years, I felt seen. I opened them to see veterans saluting from their pews, cousins wiping tears, neighbors ashamed of their whispers, young women staring at me with wide, burning eyes, and my mother crumpled, silent, her empire dissolving around her. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I stood steady, at ease, like a soldier after battle. because this was never about her destruction. It was about my reclamation. Later, by my father's grave, the applause still echoed in my ears. But layered beneath it, I heard something else, the faint clap of leather gloves against my shoulders in a rack, the murmured thank yous of men who had lived another day because I had stayed my course. Vindication is fleeting, but purpose lingers, because the fiercest battles aren't always fought overseas. Sometimes they're fought in our own homes, against silence sharp enough to wound. And sometimes the victory isn't the roar of triumph, but the quiet knowledge that truth, once spoken, cannot be erased. And in that moment, with the winter sun glinting off my medals and the flag on his grave, I understood I had not only survived my mother's war, I had won. When the final hymn faded, the sanctuary emptied into winter light. The applause still rang in my ears, echoing through my chest like the heartbeat of something larger than myself. For the first time, I had not been erased. For the first time, the truth had spoken louder than the lies. Outside the church, a crowd had gathered. Neighbors, veterans, strangers, faces flushed with recognition, hands reaching, voices rising in words I had longed to hear. "We're proud of you, Captain Hayes. Your father would be honored. Thank you for your service." Their voices wrapped around me like a chorus, a warmth I had not expected, a balm against years of silence. And yet, beneath it all, another sound rose, a sound that no applause could drown. Al Anbar, a night mission gone wrong. A young lieutenant, barely 20, his laughter still boyish even under the weight of his helmet. He had tapped my shoulder after a successful sortie, his gloves smacking against my flight suit. "You kept us alive, ma'am. You brought us home." Hours later, he was gone. His jet never returned from the next run. As hands now reached for mine, as cameras flashed, as strangers embraced me, it was his face that surfaced. Not my mother's collapse, not my father's vindication, but the boy who never came home. I stood still in the swirl of bodies and noise, my medals heavy against my chest, my heart heavier still, because applause is fleeting. Recognition is fleeting, but loss, it stays. It lingers in the quiet, in the shadows, in the spaces no one else can see. I smiled at them, the neighbors, the veterans, the children who stared up at me wide-eyed as if I were something more than human. I let them clasp my hands, let them speak their thanks. But inside, I whispered a different thanks. To him, to all of them. To the ones who never got to walk out of the desert, who would never hear their names spoken in sanctuaries or see their medals gleam in sunlight. And that is when I knew this fight, this victory, could not end with me. It had to become something larger, something lasting. Not revenge, not even vindication. Legacy. The crowd pressed closer, their words a tide. But my mind was already elsewhere, already sketching the first outlines of what must come next. A scholarship, a foundation, a memorial not just for my father, but for every forgotten soldier. A place where no one's name could be erased. I looked once more at the church doors behind me, the sanctuary where truth had finally broken through. Then I turned forward into the cold January air, the applause fading behind me, and the memory of that young lieutenant walking beside me, silent, steady, as if to say, "Carry us with you. Don't let us vanish." And I promised him I would. The sanctuary had emptied, but my war wasn't over. Even after the last hymn dissolved into silence and the veterans lowered their salutes, I lingered by my father's grave, the medals on my chest catching slivers of pale sunlight. Around me, the murmurs of the crowd faded into the distance, replaced by the low rustle of wind through winter-bare trees. The applause inside still echoed in my ears. For the world, that clapping had been vindication. For me, it was something stranger. Every burst of sound had carried me back to Iraq, to that one night after we limped back from a mission in Fallujah. I had landed shaken, blood roaring in my ears, convinced we wouldn't all make it home. Then Sarah, still smelling of jet fuel and dust, had slapped my shoulder hard enough to sting. "We made it, Lex," she'd said, eyes fierce. "We made it." The men in the hangar clapped too, rough, unpolished, alive. That night applause meant survival. Today it meant truth. And yet, standing at the grave, I knew vindication was not the same as peace. Peace was quieter, more fragile, something you have to build with your own hands. I turned from the coffin, the folded flag still pressed in my mind like a phantom weight. I knew what my mother expected of me now, that I would seize what I had won. The house, the inheritance, the name. But revenge had never been my father's lesson. Service had. Rachel reminded me of that when we sat down together, 3 weeks later in a law office that smelled faintly of leather and dust. She spread the documents out, her neat handwriting filling the margins. "You could fight for the house and keep it," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Legally, you have every right now. The smear campaigns are dismantled, the truth is public, the leverage is yours." But her eyes lifted to mine, sharp but questioning. "The question is, what do you want to do with it?" That night, I dreamed of Iraq again, of a boy no older than 20 who once shoved a photograph into my hand, his fiancée smiling under a tree. He died 2 weeks later in a fireball that lit up the desert night. When I woke, the photo was still in my mind, and I knew. "We turned the house into a legacy," I told Rachel. "Not for me, for them, for every kid who lost a parent in uniform, for the children left behind." Rachel's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Then we'll build something she can never touch." And so, the Colonel Marcus Hayes Legacy Fund was born. With Rachel's guidance, the house was transferred into a trust. Its rent, once flaunted at galas, would now feed into scholarships for the children of fallen and wounded service members. I watched the paperwork finalize, each page stamped and signed, and felt a strange release. The house that had once been my prison, the site of my mother's control, had been transformed into something she could never reclaim. The first letters arrived in spring. Veterans wrote from across the country, men and women my father had commanded years ago. They sent checks folded into envelopes, but more than that, they sent stories. Tales of his leadership in the field, of the nights he had stayed up late fixing a broken Jeep, of his quiet humor. One wrote simply, "Your father kept me alive in 1989. I want to keep his spirit alive for someone else now." Reading those words was like assembling a mosaic of the man I thought I knew. My father had always been steady, but now I saw just how far his steadiness had reached. The fund grew. Ava published a feature in a national paper, "From Silence to Legacy, a Daughter's War Turns into Hope." For the first time, my story wasn't twisted or erased. It was told with dignity. People read it. People cared. Donations poured in. Neighbors who once averted their eyes in grocery aisles now stopped me to press my hand, whispering, "We're proud of you." I didn't need their pride, but I accepted it anyway, not for me but for the cause. My mother, of course, was livid. Each month, her rent check flowed into the trust, redirected from her vanity into children she would never meet. The first time she realized this, she stormed into Rachel's office, pearl necklace glinting, voice sharp enough to cut glass. Rachel never flinched. She simply pointed at the signed clauses, airtight and binding. My mother's fury was useless against law. For once, silence became her only option. Sometimes I think of her sitting alone in that mansion that no longer feels like a kingdom. Each dollar she sends a reminder, power built on lies crumbles. Service endures. Months passed. The storm of scandal faded. Reporters moved on to fresher scandals, fresher tragedies. But within me, something shifted. For years, I had carried a gnawing hunger to be seen, to be acknowledged. Now, I no longer needed the validation. The truth was already standing tall, woven into the lives of children who would carry it forward. One morning, an email arrived. Subject line, "Thank you." I opened it and a video began to play. A young girl appeared on screen, Emily, 17, hair tied back, standing in a dorm room with a college pennant pinned to the wall. Her eyes shone with tears. "I just wanted to say thank you," she whispered. "The scholarship from the Hayes Fund made this possible. My mom couldn't afford tuition. I thought I'd have to give up. But now I'm here because of your father's legacy, because someone believed in me." When the video ended, I sat frozen, staring at the screen. My throat tightened, my eyes blurred. In that quiet moment, I understood no thunder of applause, no headline, no courtroom victory could equal this. A single life lifted. A single dream preserved. That was the real victory. Have you ever felt years of struggle dissolve into lightness with just a few words? That was what it felt like then. Spring turned into summer. I was invited to speak at West Point, my alma mater. Standing on that stage, looking out at rows of cadets in crisp gray uniforms, I felt my father's presence steady at my back. I told them not just about Iraq, not just about flying into fire, but about the hidden wars. "We train you here for the desert, for the skies over Kandahar or Baghdad," I said. "But sometimes the hardest battlefield isn't overseas. Sometimes it's here, in the living rooms of our own families. Sometimes the silence of those who should love you wounds deeper than enemy fire. And yet the choice remains the same. Do you let that silence define you, or do you rise anyway?" They listened. Their faces were still, solemn, their eyes locked on mine. And I thought, if even one of them carries this lesson forward, then my story has done its job. Afterward, a young female cadet approached me. She saluted, her hand trembling slightly. "Ma'am," she said, voice low, "my family doesn't believe I belong here. They say the army will ruin me. But hearing you today, hearing you makes me think I can do this." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to prove them wrong," I told her. "You just have to prove yourself right." Her eyes brimmed, but her back straightened. And I knew I had just spoken to my younger self. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat by the window watching the stars. Orion, Cassiopeia, the constellations my father once traced with his finger. His voice whispered in memory, "It's the dim stars, Lexi. The ones that guide you when you're lost." I used to resent being unseen. Now I understood. I wasn't meant to dazzle. I was meant to endure, to guide, to light a path for others, and that was enough. So this is my final message to you, wherever you are. The hardest battlefield is not out there in the desert. It's here in our homes, in our hearts. But victory doesn't always mean destroying your enemies. Sometimes victory means building something they cannot touch. For me, it's a scholarship fund. A girl named Emily in her dorm room. A cadet who now believes she belongs. For you, maybe it's something different. But the truth is the same. Your worth is not measured by who refuses to see you. It's measured by the lives you touch, the legacy you leave behind. And maybe that's the only kind of glory that really matters. If this story has resonated with you, if you've ever fought a battle in silence or carried scars no one else could see, I invite you to walk with us. Subscribe to Military Revenge for more stories like this. Stories not just of war, but of survival, of courage, of finding light in the darkest places. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone. Because in the end, that's what we're all searching for. A reminder that our fight matters, that our stories matter, that we matter.